How's it going, everyone? Story time. I call this story, So You Call That a Buttweld? So, those of you who have heard my stories at Testify, Backyard Story Night, Hyde Park Storytelling, all those places, you know that I've had a weird upbringing. I grew up on a really tiny dairy farm, and the school where I went only went up to 8th grade because the little town was so small. And after that, we had a choice. We could either choose to go to high school at West High School, or we could go to Aquila. Now, West was a lot bigger than our tiny school. And if you're unfamiliar with West, that's where the Kolaches are at. That's where West Vest was at. That's where that huge fertilizer explosion was so many years ago. And West had a really particular culture back in the early 90s. Back then, it was all about cowboy culture. Cowboy hats and cowboy boots and Garth Brooks and Reba McEntire. And if you weren't into that, you could be into football, and everyone loved football in West. Huge, huge deal every Friday night, go to the football games. But if you didn't really fit into those two things, and there was overlap between the Cowboys and the football players, but if you didn't fit into one of those two things, there wasn't that many places for you. And so after transitioning from Golson to West, it was a hard transition for me. My 91-92 school year was not great. For example, you had to choose between electives during your freshman year, and two of the electives you had to choose between. One, you could choose to take home ec. The other, you could choose to take ag shop. Well, in home ec, you got to cook and you got to eat. You got to sew things, and in ag shop, you stood outside in a hot tin building and welded and messed with cattle trailers. Well, I grew up on a dairy farm. The last thing I wanted to do during school was actually do more dairy shit. So obviously, I took home ec, and it was awesome. We learned to cook. I love cooking. Even better, we could eat what we cooked, which was awesome. The sewing section, amazing. I sewed myself a costume. I called myself Kung Fu Sew. I sewed myself a holster for my scissors. I had a bandolier that had all kinds of needles over it, and I got myself a headband, and I would come through and I would karate stuff. It was amazing. But you can imagine that as a guy taking cooking classes at a school like West, that was fuel for being picked on. A lot of homophobic remarks, a lot of bad names tossed around at you, and I always thought it was kind of ironic that the guys that called me all kinds of names for being in home ec, basically insulting me, they were stuck in a hot tin building with a bunch of other sweaty dudes. But I was the one who was weird because I wanted to stay in the air conditioning and eat and hang out with a room full of 25 girls. In any case, it was tough, and so for me, my my sophomore year, I chose to go to Aquila. Now, Aquila was a much smaller school, and it was even more country than West, but a different kind of country. West was drugstore cowboy country. That was guys who wore cowboy hats, but worked at the cell phone store in town. Like, they weren't for real cowboys. Aquila, real cowboys. People actually worked in the fields and stuff. So for me, especially at that time period, it was a little bit discerning. I mean, there's me. Can you imagine that guy? Can you imagine this guy in a school where a couple of people drove tractors to school? It was a tough go. You know what I'm saying? It was a very, very tough go. I mean, here I am again, and can you imagine that in an ag shop? Can you imagine that welding? Blows my mind. But in Aquila, I wasn't disliked. I didn't feel like I was picked on. It just kind of felt out of place. I mean, here I am in the best dressed photo. Look at that. And I'm wearing my best Stone Temple Pilot shirt. I could barely be bothered to pull my hair back. And I'm wearing an Ankh necklace. And I was voted best dressed, which is hysterical to me. One of the places at Aquila that I had the most trouble was in ag shop. So at Aquila, they didn't have enough money to even offer home ec. And so we had to take ag. And ag sucked. Ag was taught by this gentleman. His name was Mr. Choate, and Mr. Choate hated me. And in fact, if you heard one of my stories at Testify called A Roach's Tale, Mr. Choate was the one who nicknamed us the Roaches. And the reason he did that was because the administration, we didn't play football, me and my friends, and so we didn't have anything to do last period. The administration told Mr. Choate that he had to watch us because he only had a few classes, and so he was the most obvious choice. And he was livid about it. And we heard him screaming at the principal from inside the offices saying he wasn't going to watch those goddamn roaches. So that's where that name came from. Compliments of Mr. Choate. One of the things that he told us, and he hated me, by the way. Can you imagine him, this man, teaching this guy? Oh, God, we did not get along at all. But one of the parts where we disagreed vehemently was during the section on welding in Ag Shop. He told us that if we could take a pipe and we could weld it onto a flat piece of metal perpendicularly, upside down, that he would automatically give us, and have it hold water once we turned it right side up. So basically this, let me see if I can pull it up. Basically this, if we could do this upside down, weld it upside down, and then turn it right side up and have it hold water, we would pass the rest of the year. We wouldn't have to do anything. He told us that we could just hang out outside. Well, this sounded amazing to me. And so basically the type of joint this is, it's called a butt weld. It's basically when you have two pieces of metal in the same plane and you weld them together, whether it's a pipe on top of something or two pieces of metal like that. It's called a butt weld. So he told us that if we were able to do that, he would pass us for the entire year. No work. We could just hang outside and he wouldn't have to mess with us. This sounded amazing to me. And what he didn't know was that I had welded before. I lived on a dairy farm, and in addition to that, my grandfather, there's me and Papa, my grandfather had worked in a machine shop for almost 50 years. And Papa is an excellent welder. He's in his 90s now. He's still an excellent welder. And so I told Papa what he had told me. He laughed and said that's one of the easiest things to do. And he started teaching me. The only problem with welding something upside down, the only reason Mr. Choate assigned it, is because welding upside down like that, we were using stick welders with these big welding rods. Number one, it's difficult to do without burning through the metal. And number two, slag hits you in the face and in the chest. And we didn't have chest protectors at school. It was cheap. So you had to wear your crappiest t-shirt whenever you were welding because you get burn marks all in it. So Papa showed me how to do this. Wasn't hard. We welded. I could do it all day long. Took it to school, told Mr. Choate what I was able to do with these butt welds, showed him, didn't care. I still had to do all the work. Well, by this point, we already were not on the best of terms, but after he did this, I had no respect for the man. Ever. After that. Horrible. And so I had to go through the entire module of welding. I already knew what I was doing. It was terrible. And by the time we got to the end of it, one of the things he wanted us to do was he wanted us to be able to weld nails together. And again, the only reason that this is a challenge, so let's imagine these are two nails. The only reason this is a challenge is because the cheap-ass welding rods we had were so big that you would burn through them before you could actually put a bead between them. Those big welding rods would just shear them in half, weld them in half. So anyway, he told us he wanted us to do a butt weld using nails. Fine. So everyone's doing their work. He goes around and he's checking everybody's work. And he gets to me, and I show him what I had done. And as he walked up to me, I said, "So is this a butt weld?" And I showed him what I'd done, which was this. And I said, "Or is this a dick weld?" And he failed me, even though I did it properly. Look at this. This is the actual thing, by the way. There's one. If you can't see that, it's one guy sitting on another guy's dong, and I did the butt weld. I did two of them, two butt welds right there, with nails. Almost 20 years later, still going strong. My butt weld. Look how good my butt weld is, and not to mention my dick weld. Dick weld's fantastic, still holding up. In any case, Mr. Choate did not think that was funny. And he ended up failing me for that module. And I almost failed that year of high school because of Ag Shop. Anyway, that's my story. Hope everyone's doing well. Take care of yourselves.